so what we're going to do now is we are going to continue on with our look at observational learning, and then we're going to begin our look at rule-governed behavior. So rule-governed behavior, the second half of today's class, we're going to take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of rule-governed behavior. We're going to take a look at what it actually is, and then we're going to take a look at a very specific subset of rule-governed behavior, which is the personal rules. Rules that we use for self-regulation. We'll take a look at some of the intricacies there. But before we get there, we're going to finish up our look at observational learning. So we're going to have a really quick recap. We're going to finish up our look at factors of acquisition and factors of performance. And then we're going to take a look at an example of that in action, and then the bystander effect, and see if we can explain the mystery of the bystander effect with an appeal to observational learning. So we'll begin with just a quick recap. So if you recall, observational learning is also called social learning. This is where the behavior of an observer is affected or changed by witnessing a model. So a model is witnessed by an observer. So that's the model right there. That would be the observer right there. And because of the model's actions, the observer's behaviors are changed. That's the essence of observational learning. So it's a different form of learning. It's not classical conditioning. It's not operational behavior. There's no necessarily reinforcement. It's just simply looking at a model do something, and then you yourself do that particular behavior. So we took a look at factors that affect acquisition and performance in observational learning. So acquisition is whether or not you can learn how to do that behavior. Acquisition is the actual acquiring of the knowledge to be able to do that behavior. So what factors influence whether you will acquire that knowledge? And then performance is the actual doing of the behavior. So what factors are going to influence whether they actually do the behavior? So they might learn the behavior, but decide not to do it. What aspects actually influence whether or not they will do that behavior? That's the performance side. So as we saw with the example of my daughter, she learned how to do this particular move here from watching the She-Ra cartoon. And as we saw last time, she had the opportunity, if you just take a look at exposure to stimuli, if you just take a look at exposure to models, she had the opportunity to observationally learn from She-Ra. She had the opportunity to observationally learn from Bo. She also had the opportunity to observationally learn from Hordak. Those three characters are definitely the most featured characters in that cartoon. However, she learned specifically from She-Ra. So why is that? Why would that be the case? Well, it has to do with factors of acquisition and factors of performance. So just to briefly recap the acquisition, first factor of acquisition is the consequences of the model's behavior. The more the model is reinforced for doing their particular behavior, the more likely the observer is to acquire that knowledge. The more the model is punished for doing their behavior, the less the observer is likely to acquire that knowledge as well. So if you take a look at the old, the 1985 She-Ra cartoon, She-Ra is highly reinforced for just about everything that she does. This is a 1980s cartoon. The good guys always win, usually with relative ease. So she was highly reinforced for all of her actions. Bo was slightly reinforced, but he kept getting into trouble, so his actions were punished. Hordak always lost, so his actions were always punished. And therefore, according to the principles of acquisition, Isabella should have been more likely to model and learn from She-Ra's behavior, which, as we saw, she did. So that's the first one, the consequences of the model's behavior. And this is why just as an aside, we're going to talk a little bit, we always kind of bring in movie examples here. When they were talking about gun violence in movies, one of the biggest criticisms is when there was no consequences to the violence in movies, when there was no consequences to the people for doing this violence, and because people were worried that that would encourage others to replicate those acts of violence if there was no consequences. And they were absolutely correct. That's what this consequences of the model's behavior meant. So in the 1980s, when Arnold Schwarzenegger would tear through just battalion after battalion of soldiers with nary a scratch on him, that violence was highly reinforced. People were much more likely to imitate or learn how to imitate that violence through observational learning than if it was a gritty, realistic, consequence-driven sort of, what was that one? Just went out of my head. The one where they're trying to save Matt Damon, not from Mars, but from war. Anybody remember the Steven Spielberg? I don't got Malia here, she's my Google person. Saving Private Ryan, thank you. Saving Private Ryan, you're much less likely to go through observational learning for Saving Private Ryan because many people get killed and injured, they get punished for their gun behavior. All right, reinforcement for attending to the model. If you get reinforced for actually looking and paying attention to the model, you're more likely to go through acquisition. So Isabella was more reinforced for paying attention to Shira, definitely than she was for paying attention to Hordak. As good parents, you wouldn't say things like, oh, let's take a look at what the villain's doing. Let's pay attention to the evil that he's doing. You want them to pay attention to the heroes. So that was another factor that contributed. Skills to benefit from the modeling, this is a big one as well. So you can only benefit from modeling if you kind of have the skills in place already from which to benefit from the modeling. So when Isabella was 1.5 years old, when she lifted that stick, she had motor skills that were not quite as developed as you would need to benefit from Beau's behavior of the very complicated nooking your arrow, pulling it back, and shooting the bow. That's a big, complicated move. Lifting a sword over your head, less complicated. So she had the motor skills to benefit from that modeling, which is why she did that behavior, but she did not have the motor skills to benefit from the other form of modeling, which is why she didn't model, for example, Beau. And then I believe there's one more. Oh yes, the personal characteristics of the modeling. This is where we left off last time. So personal characteristics of the model, the more you have in common, or the more you perceive you have in common with the model, the more likely you are to go through acquisition. So even at about 1.5 years old, apparently Isabella knew that she had more in common with this character over here than she did with either of these two characters over here. And we ended this with this psychological truth, this psychological phenomenon is why people get offended when they see certain celebrities act in certain ways, and not offended when other celebrities act in the exact same way. And the reason has to be with the characteristics of the model. So people were, as I mentioned, highly offended, going into a little bit of a rage quit when Miley Cyrus was shown smoking marijuana, but nobody was outraged when Willie Nelson was smoking marijuana. And again, it has to do with that acquisition. You are more likely to acquire that information when your personal characteristics line up with the personal characteristics of the model. So Willie Nelson's smoking of marijuana probably influenced a lot of older males to get into marijuana use. And nobody's worried about a 60-year-old, 70-year-old individual finally deciding that they're going to try marijuana for the first time, for example. People are much more worried about individuals with Miley Cyrus's characteristics learning or acquiring that knowledge. So if you have characteristics in common with Miley Cyrus, you are probably a young girl, right? That's what Miley Cyrus is. She has those characteristics. So this means that this action here was more likely to induce young girls to learn how to how to smoke marijuana, and that's why they were outraged for this, and that's why they'll say things like, oh, don't you know that you're a role model? And as much as celebrities will always say, well, I'm not a role model, I'm not meant to be a role model, I'm not trying to be a role model, psychology says you're a role model. You're a role model for people that share your characteristics. And incidentally, one last little aside, personal characteristics of the model and modeling behavior. All of these consequences of the model's behavior, especially personal characteristics of the model, if you noticed the recent upswing in alt-right and basically racist rhetoric in our culture, it coincided with a certain person getting elected to the office of president, and it happened partially because the consequences of the model's behavior were reinforced, and the personal characteristics of that model matched up with their characteristics, so they were more likely to imitate that particular behavior. All right, so that's acquisition. Let's go to performance instead. So acquisition is factors that will contribute to you learning the behavior. Performance is factors that will contribute to you doing the behavior. And some of these will overlap, such as the first one, the consequences of the model's behavior. So not only are you more likely to learn how to do the behavior by watching a model that is reinforced for that behavior, you're also more likely to do that behavior when you see a model that is reinforced for that behavior. So again, watching an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie from the 80s like Commando is more likely, or you're more likely to perform those particular acts than you would be if you watched a more realistic movie where it was not reinforced, such as Saving Private Ryan. Observers' reinforcement for performing the behavior. So this one isn't too much of a surprise, but if you reinforce the observer for performing the behavior, they're more likely to continue performing the behavior. So as fans of She-Ra, you can imagine that me and my wife were very excited when we saw Isabella lift that stick to lift her stick aloft, and we wish she said, for the honor of Grayskull, that would have been awesome. But anyways, you can bet that we were like, oh my God, that's so cute, let's take some photos, let's do this, my daughter, I love you so much. She was reinforced for performing that behavior. So she learned it. She did it the first time through observational learning, but she was more likely to do it in the future because she actually was reinforced for performing that behavior. And then the last one is the observer's actual history for performing modeled behaviors. So this one is really interesting because the more you were reinforced for performing modeled behaviors, the more you are reinforced for copying other individuals, the more likely you're going to copy individuals in the future, right? So the more you are reinforced for saying your ABCs, just like Elmo said his ABCs, the more you were reinforced for singing along to I'm trying to pick ones that were in between when when I was a child and in between when Isabella was a child. The more that you are reinforced for modeling, we'll go back to Sesame Street. The more you're reinforced for modeling the two-headed monster saying the word, the more likely you are to model other people's behavior in the future. And again, this is something that part of our society is actually based on. So, we use this to teach our children. We use this to teach social customs, right? So when you're out and about, when you're a young child and you love to point at people, right? And you point at somebody else, and your parents are like, oh no, pointing is rude. You don't point to people in public. And then when you don't point, you get reinforced for not doing what other people, doing what other people are doing. You kind of set up that history of getting reinforced for following other people's behaviors. So it's not a bad thing. It's the way that we learn a lot of things. But the more you have a history of being reinforced, the more you're going to, in the future, perform those modeled behaviors. All right, so any questions on acquisition or performance? All right, so let's take a look at 2 examples of this in practice. So here we go. Here's a little bonus section. So when I teach, I use a lot of visuals. I like using visuals, and when I do my in my research, I also take a look at visual metaphors and the impact of visual metaphors. And this is a nice example of the importance of visuals, and it's a nice example of the importance of observational learning. It's 2 examples in one on the importance of observational learning. And this comes from a pamphlet that came about as a result of, once again, somebody's election. What to do if you are witnessing Islamophobic harassment. So basically this is can be generalized to what to do if you are witnessing, insert here, whatever harassment you might have seen. So this was a pamphlet that was going around, and it uses observational learning in 2 different ways. So we'll take a look at it kind of step by step. So it goes, what to do if you are witnessing Islamophobic harassment, a bystander's guide to help the person who's being targeted. So it goes, engage in conversation, go to them, sit beside them and say hello, try to appear calm, collected, and welcoming, ignore the attacker. It goes, pick a random subject and start discussing it. It can be anything, a movie you like, the weather, saying you like something they wear and asking where they got it. And it goes, keep building a safe space, keep eye contact with them, and don't acknowledge the attacker's presence. The absence of response from you 2 will push them to leave the area shortly. And then it has to do with what to do afterwards. Continue the conversation until the attacker leaves. Escort them to a safe place if necessary. And the last one was respect their wishes if they tell you that they're okay and they just want to go. So this is a nice example of, number 1, observational learning in the actual technique. So the observational learning comes into play with what this person does to diffuse the situation. And notice that what they're trying to do is they have somebody who is being aggressive. They have somebody that is attacking, and that is not the behavior that they want to continue. So they have an aggressive attacking behavior. And the mistake that many people do in this particular situation is they counter that aggressive attacking behavior with aggressive attacking behavior, right? So they'll get into this person's face and they'll say things like, how dare you? You can't do this. She has a right to be here. She's an American citizen. Shame on you, right? They'll get into this person's face, and what happens is that this person, who is now in an aggressive attack from this person, will, through observational learning, mimic that behavior. Through observational learning, they will see a model right in front of them that is being aggressive, that is being attacking, and they will, through observational learning, not a conscious result, but through observational learning, they will then also attack. They will then also become more aggressive, and it just circles through and the entire situation escalates. Notice that this pamphlet suggests using observational learning. So first off, she ignores the attacker. She talks directly to the person that is being attacked, and she is trying to appear calm, trying to appear collected, and trying to appear welcoming. The attacker has no choice but to see that behavior, to see the calm, to see the collected, to see the welcoming, and whether they want to or not, they are going through observational learning. They themselves start to acquire the skills for calm, welcoming, and collected. They start to acquire the performance of calm, welcoming, and collected. Notice that she completely ignores the attacker. So she's not modeling attacking behavior by attacking them, and she is ignoring them, hoping that they will start modeling the behavior of ignoring this individual. So they are being ignored. They can't help but learn to ignore other people because of that. And then that diffuses the situation through, again, observational learning. Through observational learning, they actually increase the probability that this individual will not only acquire, but perform the act of, in this case, ignoring the situation and leaving. So that's the one side of observational learning in this pamphlet. The other side of observational learning in this pamphlet, and this is where a lot of my work has to do with, is the use of visuals in this pamphlet. So because of observational learning, this, let's call it what it is, this comic book right here is actually a lot more effective at getting people to do what that pamphlet is saying than if they presented it in this form here. So notice that this has the information still there. What to do if you're witnessing Islamophobic harassment. Engage conversation. Go to them. Sit beside them and say hello. Ignore the attacker. You can get all the information for all the steps from just this verbal description. But this has no observational learning. You don't see another individual doing the actual behavior. You add the images to it, you see the actual person doing that, you can't help but go through observational learning and increase the acquisition of these particular skills and make it more likely that you will perform those particular skills in the future as well. So this is a double shot of observational learning all in one nice little pamphlet. Any questions about this one before we see another real life example? All right, so I mentioned this pamphlet. Let's take a look at a real life example where the same sort of approach is being used. So this is an example from Canada, yay Canada. And this is where a Sikh politician is going to handle a racist attack. And what I want you to do here is I want you to pay attention to what he does in response to the attack to basically go through observational learning. He's trying to get the attacker to go through observational learning. And take a look at what happens when his aides step in and decide to try to help without knowing about how observational learning actually works.
This is amazing. First of all, first question, is my voice hearing better this way or is the mic better? What do you like better? Hold on, give me 1 second. One second. Can you hear this way? Is this easier with the microphone or is it better?
Okay, so first off, he's trying to ignore her. He is trying to go through that sort of, I'll ignore her, maybe she'll pick up on that behavior, and she'll ignore me, and we can go back. But notice how hard he tries to model behaviors that he's hoping that she will pick up. Notice how hard he works to go against your human instincts to just, reciprocate in kind. And notice, watch her body language and watch her actions. It works, but every single time his aides come in, they don't understand the game plan, and they basically exacerbate the situation. So you can see it the first time here, as soon as this individual gets close to her, you can see she jumps. She immediately gets revved back up because he's coming at her with aggression, and she can't help but say, oh, I'm going to observationally learn from that. I'm going to up my aggression a little bit more.
Microphone, or is it better?
Immediately it escalated. As soon as she was confronted with aggression, all of a sudden she got very aggressive, right? And notice, tries to bring it back down one more time.
So just 1 second. Let's just, what do we believe in? We believe in love and courage, right? Love and courage. Love and courage. We believe in love. We believe in love and courage. Absolutely. Absolutely we do. We believe in love and courage. We believe in an inclusive Canada where no one's left behind. We believe in building a Canada that ensures that there's economic justice for everybody, right? And that's what we believe in. So my friend, yeah, that's it. And you are wonderful. And let's just say, as Canadians, do we believe in celebrating all diversity? Do we believe in celebrating diversity? Give it a round of applause for diversity.
So once again, he was working hard to bring her back down. And it was working. She got a little bit revved up again, but she was coming back down. She was coming down. She was actually smiling there at one point. She was bringing it down. But now notice, once she is being attacked again, once she is being dealt with in an aggressive manner where somebody approached her and got in her space, got in her face, immediately the finger comes back out. And immediately she starts getting aggressive again because it's observational learning. She saw the politician calming down. He was very like, oh, we believe in this, we believe in that. And you can see it. She was like, okay, yes, a little clap, a little smile. I'm going to, through observational learning, perform his behavior. As soon as one of the aides comes back in and starts getting in her face, all of a sudden that behavior just ramps back up, and she's once again in her face, and we get the finger pointing.
All right. It's okay. So what this
All right, so he works very, very hard throughout this entire ordeal. And you can see, I'm going to fast forward here. You can see that every single time that he works hard to bring her down, once the aides come back and basically attack her again in an aggressive manner, she jumps back up. But in the end, he finally gets to the point where he has brought her down enough, and in the end, ignored her.
Let her just speak as much as she wants. It's okay. We have no problem with it.
See?
My friends, we'll just sort this situation out. We'll be right back. I love you all. These are things that happen. It's okay. It's no big deal. We're not going to be intimidated. It's all good.
All right. So, he basically said, my friends, we're going to sort this situation out. It's no big deal. AKA, my friends, we're going to ignore this individual. It's no big deal. We'll deal with it. And at that point, she felt that she said enough and she left. So again, it's that modeling of the behavior that you're trying to bring out in this situation. Every single time he modeled calmness, every single time he modeled being welcoming, she became more calm, she became more welcome. Every time one of his aides got in her face and basically said, you got to back up, then all of a sudden the finger came back up and she was like, no, no, no. And it just ramped back up because of that observational learning. So it is a powerful, powerful technique. And again, in this real life example, it just kind of shows that if you model behavior, people that are watching you, whether they agree with you or not, whether they're on your side or not, are more likely to produce that behavior they're more likely to produce that behavior. So make sure that in interactions, you're modeling the behavior that you would like to get. All right, so that was a real life example. So the last thing we're going to do with observational learning is a bit of a challenge, and this is to use what we've learned to see if we can explain the bystander effect. So the bystander effect, you probably encountered this in your general psychology course. The bystander effect is where in an emergency situation, you are actually more likely to get help if there's only one person who is witnessing this emergency situation than if there is a group of people. So this is a huge contradiction, because you would imagine that if any single person has, let's make it easy, has a 50-50 chance of helping you, then if you're surrounded by one person and you need assistance, you got a 50-50 chance that they will help you. If you're surrounded by two people, you got a 50-50 chance that the first person will help you. You got a 50-50 chance that the second person will help you. AKA, you have a 75% chance that at least one of them will help you. If you have three people, the math would say you then have an 87.5% chance of somebody helping you. That's what the math says. Psychology says that each additional person puts your probability of getting help from anybody lower. So the more people that are around you when you need help, the lower a chance you are to actually get any assistance. So the greater number of bystanders, the less likely that any one of them will help. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at an example of that. and we're going to see if we can figure out what is going on here and how could observational learning perhaps explain this bystander effect.
Place like this street in New York City, if you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help. Help.
How long before he gets help?
Help. Help. Please help.
Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
Please, somebody help me.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help, and it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Four minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
Well, people don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they haven't got the time, they just can't get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You alright? You alright?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit sleepy, you alright?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
Well, sit up. You alright, yeah? Strong.
First I thought she was dead. Then I saw to check to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed it because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm alright.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
Why you're lying on the floor in the rain?
Because he's part of the right group. Everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping him walking past. So I'd just like to check that he was okay. So I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because it's going to ruin his suit anyway.
All right, so that is number one, quite disturbing. Number two, very, very cynical view of humanity, right? So they kept mentioning things where they're saying things like, well, you know, people just don't have the time. Oh no, they have the time, but they just don't want to get involved. Or it's easier to pass the buck. Or you know, it's easier just not to get involved. That we as a society have formed a silent agreement that we are not going to get involved. And then it gets like super cynical at the end because when Peter, I believe his name, was in a suit, he got rescued in about 6 seconds. And the reporter is like, well, of course, well, he's part of the right group. So I guess if you have money, there's an entirely different set of rules that apply to you. People will fall over themselves to help the rich if they're in need. But if you're not even a poor person, I mean, that's a nice, you know, that's a nice peacoat right there. You know, you're not going to get any help. So that's a highly cynical view of humanity. That's a humanity I wouldn't want to live in a world that was like that. So let's try to take a more positive view. Let's see about observational learning. So how could observational learning explain the bystander effect? And specifically, how can it explain two sort of factors? Number one, in the bystander effect, they mentioned that, well, people just don't want to get involved. People just don't, they don't have the time. Does anybody in that clip remember evidence that directly contradicts the idea that people don't want to get involved because they don't have time? Mm-hmm.
The guy was sitting there reading the newspaper.
Well, I mean, he clearly has time,
Yeah.
right? But what about that not getting involved? People don't want to get involved. What directly contradicts that idea that people don't want to get involved?
They don't want to get involved unless other people get involved first.
Exactly. So if they didn't want to get involved just in general, if people were horrible and they just said to themselves and said, you know what, it would take about 2 minutes out of my reading my newspaper to get involved, but I don't have the time. I'm in a very interesting article, and or I'm going to a very important business meeting and I don't have time to save a person's life. That's horrible. But if that was the case, then anybody that was worried about, or anybody that noticed this individual. So where is she? Where did she go? This woman here. All right. So she clearly notices her.
She conforms to the rule,
right?
And does nothing.
And she's all ready to go. She is all ready to leave this woman just lying there on the steps. So she doesn't have the time. She doesn't want to get involved.
Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You alright? You alright?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, a little bit clicking, you alright?
Suddenly she gets involved when somebody else helps. And if it was truly that she didn't have the time or she didn't have the will or desire to get involved, then when she was checking on that person and that construction worker walked up to her and started helping her, her reaction would have been like, oh, thank goodness I can go on my way. She's being taken care of. But that wasn't her reaction. Her reaction was, oh, okay, well now I'm going to help. So number one, how can observational learning explain this? Let's start with the easy one. Yep.
Modeling behavior.
Modeling behavior. So who's the model? The construction worker in this case is the model. This person is the observer. So she was, all for just kind of leaving, all for not helping. And then all of a sudden the construction worker came by and said, are you all right? Do you need help? And then her as an observer said, oh, okay. And then she walked up and sure enough, she was like, are you all right? Do you need help? So she got involved. So when a single person starts helping and the group starts helping, that's an example of observational learning. All of a sudden you observe a model and you are more likely to engage in that particular behavior. And if you take a look at how many people eventually end up there, or especially for this guy, you can see that there's a crowd of individuals there once one person assists. So let's take a look at the helping behavior that occurred first. How many people here, and you don't get to answer if you're in nursing, how many people here know exactly what to do if you saw somebody lying down on the steps there? Raise your hand if you know step 1, do this, step 2, do this. Okay, so we got one person, one individual out of the 20-ish that are in here right now. How could that possibly explain why nobody at all is helping? Any ideas on that? Mm-hmm.
Because they don't know how to help.
They don't know how to help. That's step number 1. What do you do when you don't know how to do something and you're in a social situation? You stay out of the way, but what else do you do? If you're in a social situation, you watch. You watch specifically, what do you watch? What was it?
Others, what others are doing.
You watch what others are doing. So everybody who noticed this individual, everybody who was walking by and said to themselves, that person probably needs help. They all thought to themselves, all right, do they really need help? Am I misinterpreting the situation? And if they do need help, what do I do? And am I supposed to move them? Am I not supposed to move them? I remember being surprised. I specifically remember this because some of my friends rode motorcycles. If you find a person in a motorcycle accident, you're not supposed to remove their helmet. You leave them where they are, because if you remove their helmet, you'll probably do more damage to their neck. You're supposed to leave them until the first responders arrive. I didn't know that. I learned that in my magazine article. So there's a lot of maybe I should do this, maybe I should do that kind of things when you see somebody that's in help. So what happens is that these individuals, they're like, oh, well, what am I supposed to do? And when you're in a situation, a social situation, when you don't know what to do, what you start doing is you start looking at other people. So a great analogy for this is a very fancy dinner party, right? Let's say that you get invited to a very fancy Christmas dinner party, and you're going there, and it's a fancy meal, and you sit at your table, and you have 18 forks on one side, you got 18 spoons on the other side, you got 18 knives in front of you, you got 12 different glasses, and somebody brings the first course and plots it down in front of you. And you don't want to make a social faux pas. You don't want to use the wrong utensil, but you have no idea what is the right thing to do with this thing that you don't even know if it's food. Maybe it's what you're supposed to drink, wash your fingers in. You have no idea what you're doing here. What's your move? What do? You look around. You start looking down the table, maybe a little subtly, and you start thinking to yourself, well, what are the people? Oh, that person's grabbing the 18th spoon. Okay, I'll grab the 18th spoon too. And they're doing this. So you start doing what other people are doing, right? You start modeling their behavior. You start through observational learning doing their behavior. Now, what happens though if nobody knows what they're doing? You're going to be looking at people and you're going to be saying, well, nobody's doing anything. And other people are going to be looking at you saying, well, that person's not doing anything and that person's not doing anything. And you basically have a chain reaction around the table where everybody's like, I guess, no, we're not supposed to eat. I guess that this is a trick. We're supposed to ignore the food or something. Through observational learning, they will end up doing nothing. And that's why, through observational learning, this bystander effect might occur. So notice that when people notice that this individual needed help, they might have very subtly, but they would have looked around and said, well, what are other people doing, right? And that woman, she noticed, she goes, well, there's that person who's absorbed just reading his newspaper. I guess that's the right thing to do. I'll just do what that person's doing. And that person reading their newspaper probably noticed the individual and said, is anybody else helping? I guess not. So not helping, is that the right move? So nobody really knows what to do until this individual comes along. And it is very telling that he is a construction worker, because he probably received, this is speculation, but I would imagine, he probably received on-the-job training about what to do in this situation. He probably was told on one of his first days at the job, if you see a construction worker on the work site and they are lying down and they appear unconscious, step one, you walk up to them and say, are you all right? Step two, you do this. Step three, you do that. So there was no, you'll notice, if we go back.
Watch what happens though when someone else helps.
You what?
He walks straight up. There is no point where the construction worker's like looking around. Construction worker just goes straight up and he's like, are you all right? Are you okay? And he dives right in. And then once other people see that's the right thing to do, or that's
She suddenly finds
behavior,
herself in a different.
then everybody else gets involved. And this is also potentially an explanation for why the person in a suit got helped almost immediately. Because in this situation here, it's a little bit more, perhaps, a little bit more ambiguous. I'm going to err on the side of humanity here. It's perhaps a little bit more ambiguous whether or not she requires assistance. Maybe she's just tired and decided to take a little nap. Maybe she's just resting her eyes. Maybe Peter, the guy before, I don't know, was just doing ab crunches and was really getting into it. I don't know, whatever they were doing, maybe they were doing that. There's a possibility. It's a little bit ambiguous. They didn't know what to do. For the suit, the best example of this is this final, not him, but the next witness. And listen to what the next witness says.
Neil, and nobody helped him walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay. So I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be because of the ruined suit anyway.
So it's not that he's rich, it's not that he's part of the right group necessarily, it's that clearly he must have been ill because he's lying there in his 400-pound suit in the wet rain. He's ruining his suit. There's no way somebody would do that if they weren't ill. It's not an ambiguous situation. So because of that, they know, there's no question, should I help, should I not help, does this person need help? It's clear, oh my gosh, super expensive suit, sitting there in the rain, clearly needs help, and then they help them. So that is my interpretation, or that is one explanation of how observational learning can account for the bystander effect. Any questions or comments on that before we wrap up our look at observational learning? All right. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we finished up our look at observational learning. So we are now going to turn to rule-governed behavior, and we'll see how much of rule-governed behavior we can introduce at this point, and we'll end where we end. Oh, there we are. All right. So we're done with observational learning. We're now turning to rule-governed behavior. And what a rule is, in the psychology of learning, what a rule is, it is a verbal description of a contingency. So it is a verbal description of, if you do this in this circumstance, this is going to occur. That's what a rule is to psychologists. So by performing a certain action in a certain setting, if you perform a certain behavior, then certain consequences will follow. So we've seen an example of this rule in the treatment of hearing. So when Dr. Fox said, you know, if you don't take off your restraints, I'm going to leave with them, right? If you want to keep your restraints, if you want to earn your restraints, you know, you take them off on your own. Dr. Fox was literally saying, in this situation now, when we're in this setting where we're treating you, if you take off your restraints, then I will allow you to earn them back. If you have me take them off, if you perform that behavior, then I will leave with them. So that's an example of a rule, a psychological rule, that verbal description of a contingency. So we also saw, you know, if you count to 100, you will earn back your restraints. That's another description of a rule, another verbal contingency. You're going to throw the ball to Bill. If you drop the ball, we're leaving, right? If you drop the ball, we're leaving with your restraints, and just so on and so forth. There were so many rules. If you get into my face, I'm going to get into your face, and you know, I'm not going to talk to you if you're really close to my face. Those are all in this treatment situation, in this treatment setting. If you perform this behavior, Harry, then this is the consequence that's going to follow. So that's an example of a rule. And rules can be used to change behavior, and you have this rule-governed behavior. So rule-governed behavior is the way that we learn a lot of the behaviors that we do. So classical conditioning and operant conditioning, those are the two major forms of learning. But we also go through observational learning. We learn from watching other people. And we also go through rule-governed behavior, rule-governed learning, learning and changing our behavior by these verbal descriptions of certain rules. And these rule-governed behaviors and the use of rules has certain advantages and disadvantages. So we'll start off with the advantages. The biggest advantage, the big one, is the rapid establishment of appropriate patterns of behavior. So it is the very quick establishment of these behavior patterns that you are trying to induce. So for example, if Dr. Fox did not tell Harry anything, if Dr. Fox was in there and just told Harry, I want you to do this task, but did not explain the consequences to Harry whatsoever, if he did not give Harry the rule that Harry was operating under, Harry eventually would have stopped self-abusing. So if Dr. Fox simply said, count to 100, and Harry self-abused, and Dr. Fox wordlessly just took the restraints and left Harry for 5 minutes, and then came back and said, count to 100, and Harry counts to 100, and wordlessly just gives him back his restraints. If that's all that Dr. Fox did, Harry would eventually have gone through punishment and extinction for self-abusing. Self-abuse would have went down, appropriate behaviors would have went up. So rules are not required for behavioral change, but they do make it a whole lot faster. If Dr. Fox had not verbalized the rules, Harry eventually would have figured them out, but it would have taken him probably months instead of the few days that the treatment actually took. It would have taken him much, much longer to establish that appropriate behavior. So it is rapid establishment of those appropriate patterns of behavior that is the major advantage of rule-governed behavior. So I'll give you another example of this from experimental psychology. So I have done experiments in psychology on human and non-human subjects. So I've tested humans and I have tested rats and pigeons in my career. And when you test a human, you have to establish contingencies for the experiment. You have to establish things like, well, this is what I would like you to do in this situation. This is what I would like you to do in this situation, and there's consequences for, you know, doing one or the other. You need to establish that contingency. And you use rule-governed behavior to establish it. You use rules. You simply tell them, well, here are the instructions for the experiment. For animal subjects, you can't tell them, oh, here are the instructions for the experiment, right? Because they don't have language. They can't talk to you. So you have to establish the rules, you have to establish a contingency, not via rules, not via the verbal descriptions. So because of that, you can rapidly establish the appropriate patterns of behavior with human subjects. So in my experiments with human subjects, 10% of my time in the experiment is spent explaining the rules and establishing the appropriate behavior. 90% of the time is the subjects actually doing the behavior. In my animal research, 80% of the time was used to establish the contingencies. 80% because I couldn't use rules. I couldn't tell them, if you press the star, I'm going to give you birdseed. If you press the square, you're not going to get any birdseed, right? I couldn't tell them that. So we spent months training them to press the star and not press the square. And then we spent a couple of weeks actually running them and collecting the data. So the inability to use rules on animal subjects led to really long times to establish the appropriate behavior and really quick times for when you can use the rules. So think about all the behaviors that we do. Think about anything that you don't do because it's illegal and you know that it's illegal. You have hopefully not once had to have been punished for doing that illegal activity, right? So think about everybody here who hasn't murdered anyone, ever, right? That was a very rapid establishment of the correct, appropriate behavior, because somewhere along the lines, somebody in authority told you, don't murder. Murder's illegal, you'll go to jail. And you said, oh, okay, so in this situation, living in society, if I perform this behavior, murder, I'm going to be sent to jail for a certain period of time. Rapid establishment of the appropriate behavior, nobody is doing that behavior. On the other hand, imagine a society where you weren't given those rules and you were just walking around and maybe at one point you just happened, this example went downhill real quick, but maybe at some point you just happened to murder somebody. And then you're like, oh my gosh, now I'm being incarcerated for 10 years or 20 years, however long it is. What did I do? So you get back out and you murder somebody else, and then you get incarcerated again, and you go through that contingency a few times, and after about 120 years, you're like, you know what, maybe I shouldn't do that murder behavior, and the murder behavior goes down. So that's the advantage of rules. Rapidly you can establish the correct behavior. Anything that you, for example, don't do because you were told not to do it, that's an example of rule-governed behavior. All right, so we just went through the big advantage of rule-governed behavior. Let's at least introduce some of the disadvantages of rule-governed behavior. And these are the ones that we have to be aware of, because rule-governed behavior is very effective, but it's not always the optimum way of changing behavior. So let's take a look at a few of these examples. It oftentimes leads to behavior that is less efficient than those that are shaped by natural contingencies. So what this means, this is a fancy way of saying that rules are better at acquisition. So rules are better at telling you how to perform a certain behavior. But actually doing the behavior and natural contingencies are better at you actually performing the behavior. And this is easily illustrated if anybody has ever tried to achieve proficiency at a sport or achieve proficiency at a musical instrument just by reading about it. So if you have ever said to yourself, you know what, I want to become the world's greatest baseball player of all time, and the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to read this entire encyclopedia of baseball. And you start reading the encyclopedia and you're like, oh, okay, first base, and that's what you do. Pitching, lift the left leg, shift your weight forward. You don't even do that. You don't even do it yourself. You're sitting there going, lift the leg left, lift the leg left leg, shift the weight forward, elbow pointing forward, do this, do this. You could read the whole thing. You could have it memorized. You could be the most knowledgeable baseball information person in the world. That will be great at acquisition because you've read all the rules. You were like, if you do this, you will throw the ball faster. If you do this, you'll be more effective at sliding into home plate. You have those rules. But you're not actually going to be able to perform it because natural contingencies are better at performance. So when you finally go out there and you start physically doing these things and you throw that ball and it doesn't even reach home plate, that's a punishment for throwing it in a certain way. When you throw it the next time and it goes a little bit further, that's a natural contingency. You've been reinforced. The ball's gone a little bit further. And those natural contingencies are better at actually putting into place performance. So this is why oftentimes you actually have to do the things, because the natural contingencies that are in place for doing things are better at making that performance aspect of it, whereas the rules are great at acquisition. So I don't want to, don't throw out rules en masse. They're great at acquiring those skills, but you actually have to go out and perform them and let those natural contingencies work in order to become good at actually doing the skills. All right, and so any questions on that? Okay, so we're going to end today with the second disadvantage, and this one is a big one. And this one is becoming bigger and bigger all the time because of the rapid change that we have in our society now. So our society is changing way faster now than it ever did before. And this is magnifying one of the big disadvantages of rule-governed behavior, and that is that rules are oftentimes insensitive to the actual contingencies in a particular setting. So you might be told this is the right way to act. And it might have been true in the past, but society has changed. So now this is the actual right way to act. But you have been told this is the right way to act. And that rule-governed behavior, make sure you do this because this is a contingency, is often insensitive to the actual contingencies that are in place. And I mentioned that this is happening a lot in our society today, and I will give you 2 examples of that. And, you know, they'll both come from the entertainment world. All right, so this is Harvey Weinstein. Currently, well, you'll see where he currently is. But Harvey Weinstein was basically patient 0 of the Me Too movement, right? He was basically the first high-profile Hollywood figure that got called out for sexual harassment. And he, for years, was operating under a certain rule. He was operating under a certain rule-governed behavior. And that behavior was, again, in a certain setting, if you perform a certain behavior, then a certain consequence will follow. The rule for him was that in Hollywood, in that setting, if you perform or if you sexually harass, then a certain consequence will follow. You will get gratification. So that was the rule that he was under. And I'm sure that was reinforced and maybe even told to him by people in the business. In Hollywood, if you sexually harass, then you will get gratification. He was operating under that rule for a long time. It was also operating under the rule that in Hollywood, if you sexually harass, then nothing will happen, right? He was untouched for years and years and years. He was operating under these 2 rules. In this situation, you do this, then this will happen. Rose McGowan was also operating under certain rules. So she also had rules that were probably told to her. In a certain situation, if you perform a certain behavior, then certain consequences will follow. In Hollywood, if you accuse a powerful person, then your career will be destroyed, right? So rule number 1, and she was probably told this, she was probably told somebody, look, Harvey, you know, Weinstein did these things to me, and that person said, well, if you ever want to act again, you know, this is the way that it goes. So that was a rule that she was following. In Hollywood, if you accuse a powerful person, your career will be destroyed. She was also operating under the rule that in Hollywood, if you accuse a powerful person, then you will be blamed. So oftentimes it's the victim that gets blamed in these situations. And even worse, in Hollywood, if you accuse a powerful person, then no one will believe you. So those used to be the rules. Those used to be the rules for decades in Hollywood, but society changed. And those rules that were told and that kind of climate that was in place, that changed before the rules did. So the rules used to be that you will get gratification. If you sexually harass, you will get gratification. If you sexually harass, nothing will happen. That rule became insensitive to the actual contingencies. And we know that because Harvey Weinstein is currently on trial for rape. So the rule of nothing will happen is clearly false, clearly insensitive to the contingencies in today's society. You take a look at Rose McGowan. In Hollywood, if you accuse a powerful person, then no one will believe you. That has also changed. So we have the Believe Women movement that is currently going on. We have more credibility being given to those stories than ever before. So clearly this rule is no longer in place. It is insensitive to the actual contingency, and a new rule has replaced it. So again, this is an example of the rules that are stated might actually be insensitive to the rules that were there. Because when Rose McGowan first came out, where'd she go? We'll wrap up on this. When Rose McGowan first came out, people were probably still telling her, don't do it. It's a bad idea. You know, don't accuse Weinstein. And she did it anyway, only to find out that the rules that she thought were in place weren't actually in place. And again, that's because rule-governed behavior can oftentimes be insensitive to what is actually going on. All right, so that is where we'll wrap up for this time. We'll finish our look at rule-governed behavior next time we meet. And other than that, we're done for today.